This is one of those exercises that you might just want to kick back and watch the show and maybe jot some notes as we go here. This exercise is not going to involve any project files. As a matter of fact, it's only going to involve the color palette. So I'm going to tear this guy away so we can zero in on him and focus on him. Now, inside the color palette, I have RGB color sliders. If you are indeed following along, if you've decided to follow along, from the color palette drop-down menu, just make sure you're on RGB sliders to follow along here. So first of all, RGB, as we already know, is comprised of red, green, and blue. And this is called an additive color space. In other words, I can add red and green and blue together to create colors, right? Now these three sliders that we have, red, green, and blue, have 256 levels each. So for instance, let me take green and blue and drop them all the way down to 0, and I'll use red as my example here. So I'm going to drop red all the way over to the left, 0. So there's the 0 value right there. So from 0 all the way up, the maximum value is 255, okay? So that's 256 levels, right? 0 being a level. So what I can do is I can come along and I can set from 0 to 255 for all three scales, or for all three sliders, right? So maybe I want some kind of a purplish, kind of magenta color there. Well, the RGB color values for this particular color shade would be 195, 103, and 255. So oftentimes I might be sampling a color from somewhere, and on a scrap piece of paper I'll jot down the RGB color values. Oh, it's 141, 103, and 76. And then I'll come into Photoshop and I'll go and set this color to use inside a layout, right? But the idea here is that I'm adding these colors together. Now, if I have all three sliders maxed out at 255, this is why RGB is referred to as an additive color space, what I wind up with is pure white. Think of 3 spotlights. This is the example I use. One with a red light bulb, one with a green bulb, and one with a blue light bulb. If all 3 spotlights are at 100% intensity, as bright as they can go, we're going to see white light. If we take all 3 spotlights and turn them off, guess what color we're going to get? We're going to get pure black. Or if I take the red spotlight and maybe bring it up to about halfway, and I take the green spotlight and I crank them up all the way, and I take the blue spotlight and I bring them up maybe just about a quarter of the way, this is the color I'm going to get. Okay, so that's how RGB works. Now what about CMYK? Well, CMYK is actually the opposite of RGB. Check this out. I'm going to head to my color palette menu, and I'm going to head to CMYK sliders, and now what I get are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black sliders. And the CMYK color space is what's known as a subtractive color space. So check this out. I'm going to drop all my sliders all the way back over to the left, so everything's at 0 right now. And each of these sliders, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, is comprised of percentages. So right now, all 4 sliders are at 0%. So each scale or each slider goes all the way up to 100%. Okay? So if I have 0% cyan, 0 magenta, 0 yellow, and 0 black, I get pure white. If I take all 4 sliders and crank them all up to 100%, of course, as you might guess, we would get 100% black. Okay, so again, it's the opposite of RGB. So how I think of CMYK, and this works for me because I'm into visual arts and I'm into drawing and painting and things like this, is I think of a traditional artist's color palette. You know, he's holding in his hand. And if he takes a little bit of cyan and he might drop that onto his palette, and then he might throw in a little bit of magenta as well and mix the two together, and this is the color he's going to wind up with. And then he might throw in a little bit of yellow as well just to punch it up a bit. And then maybe he wants to darken it just a little bit by throwing in some black as well. This is the color we'd wind up with. So once again, sometimes I'll sample a color in CMYK, and then on a scrap piece of paper I'll jot down the percentages: 53, 71, 33, and 11. That's the difference between the RGB color space, an additive color space, and the CMYK color space, of course, a subtractive color space.